My name is Murad Dagli, and I'm one of the directors of Conferencias, along with Arlen Alvarez and David Alatorre. We would like to welcome you to Convergencias 2014 Mexico Rising. As many of you know, last Monday, Time magazine released a cover of Enrique Peña Nieto claiming that he was saving Mexico. Immediately, the online community backlashed by criticizing Michael Crowley, the author of the article, and going as far as to claim that he had been bribed by Peña Nieto himself. Some more creative and lighthearted techies came up with jokes and alternative issues of the magazine. My two personal favorites being one cover depicting Peña Nieto dressed up as a Chapulín Colorado, and an image of Peña Nieto sitting on Uncle Sam's lap. Uncle Sam asks him, ¿Te gustó eso de Saving Mexico? And Peña Nieto replies, La única palabra que entendí fue México. Comedy aside, the cover depicts many of the core issues that prompted the theme of this year's conference. Ever since Peña Nieto came to power, the media has been bombarded by publicity declaring that Mexico has a promising future. Journalists quote a robust and stable economy, one of the most powerful in Latin America, innovative and long-needed reforms, and political coalitions, among many other things. But while Mexico might be rising in the eyes of the international community, many Mexicans, such as the people that reacted to the article, see a completely different story. Violence is far from slowing down, and some people, desperate for a solution, have taken matters into their own hands by forming popular militias. Some of the initiatives that have been fostered by the government to supposedly empower its citizens, such as the Iniciativa Ciudadana, have lacked the input of the citizens themselves. Poverty remains high, despite positive macroeconomic outlooks. But despite all the problems that belong to the undeniable reality of our country, I would dare to say that Mexico is rising. But it is not rising because Moody's bumped its credit rating to an A, or because it is a favorite nation among Wall Street investors. Mexico is rising because many of its citizens acknowledge the problems that plague the country and are critical of its government, but do not stop there. Mexico is rising because its citizens are more vocal than ever, and their voices include not only criticisms, but also proposals that they expect their leaders to hear and to take into consideration. Mexico is rising because it has people that are willing to pour their hearts and souls into their careers and professions, some of which are even willing to sacrifice their attachment to home so that they can go abroad and pursue opportunities that will help them and their countries. One of my friends asked me the other day why we're organizing Convergencias. And the first thing that came to mind was all of this. The incredible audience of passionate individuals that is standing in front of me at this moment. The hundreds of emails that we sent, the countless hours that we spent planning logistics, the painful effort that went into raising the money for this conference, all of it is worth it because of you. As citizens of Mexico and as people who feel passionate about Mexico, I hope that we take this conference as an opportunity to recharge the passion that is fueling us to fight for a better country. Today, you will hear from 7 of Mexico's top scholars and public figures. I invite you to engage with their presentations, to actively grapple with the ideas that they'll be sharing, to feel inspired by them, and to even challenge them. We want this to be a safe space where all opinions are heard, respected, and considered. Most importantly, we want you to end the day feeling as energized as ever to face Mexico's challenges with intelligence and courage. Thank you, and bienvenidos a Yale.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very glad that you're here. My name is Arlen Alvarez, and I'm the co-director of Conferencia 2014 Mexico Rising. Today we're here because of one main reason, our love for Mexico. During the conference, we're going to be able to discuss and analyze Mexico's current situation. As Mexico's next generation, we need to be aware of everything that's happening in the country, all the positive and all the negative. We have the privilege of studying here at the United States, gaining knowledge and tools that will help us improve those situations that we don't like from Mexico. I believe we need to go back to our country and share with its citizens what we have learned. We need to be part of the creation of a better Mexico. I invite all of you to use this space as a tool for connecting with other Mexicans who share your passion for Mexico. Also, I invite you to talk and discuss your ideas with our prominent speakers. I hope you enjoy the conference. Now, I'm going to present our first speaker, Dr. Denise Dresser. She is one of Mexico's most prominent political scientists. She has a PhD in political science from Princeton University. Right now, she is a political science professor at Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, ITAM. She is the author of numerous publications related to Mexican politics and currently writes a column for Reforma and Proceso. Dr. Dresser has an extensive research and teaching career that has taken her to the University of California, San Diego, University of California, Berkeley, University of Southern California, and Georgetown University, among others. She edited a best-selling collection of essays by prominent Mexican women entitled Gritos y Susurros, Experiencias Intempestivas de 38 Mujeres, and is the author of the 2012 bestseller El País de Uno, Reflexiones para Entender y Cambiar a México. Welcome, Dr. Dresser.
Thank you. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming out so early on Saturday morning to hear us talk about our country. A country that seems to be waking up, moving forward, a country that, according to the new narrative, has shown that it's ready to pact, negotiate, propose reforms, and approve them. A country that no longer wants to be hostage to archaic traditions and entrenched practices. A country ready to leave behind its heavy nationalist position about sovereignty, tossing out ideological baggage, prepared to surmount 15 years of little reforms, little growth, prepared to assume a new national consensus, embodied by the Pacto por México, the Pact for Mexico, that has become the trademark of Enrique Peña Nieto's first year. The future is promising, the foreign press says. Mexico is getting saved, Michael Crawley says. Mexico has crossed the threshold and has approved reforms that were politically unpalatable and historically rejected. Mexico has said goodbye to authoritarianism and does not need to fear its return. The former ruling party, the PRI, has reinvented itself, and so has the country, the optimists insist. Peña Nieto was brought into office by a majority of the electorate, was not designated by the dedazo. He has to coexist with a maze of checks and balances, including the Bank of Mexico, the Federal Transparency Institute, the new Telecommunications Institute, a regulatory body, an increasingly independent Supreme Court. For better or for worse, the government can no longer do whatever it pleases, as it did many years under dominant rule. It cannot simply augur that it's going to win the next presidential election. And because of that, the PRI has been willing and able to push through reforms that it promised on the fiscal, telecommunications, energy, judicial, and political front. Now, the problem with this argument is that it underestimates the complacency of the political class, the weight of the vested interests that are aligning against the reforms. It underestimates the ties that bind Peña Nieto and how they will tighten as the implementation of the reforms take place. And it doesn't give enough weight to the commitments that the president and his party have with the veto centers poised to sabotage and undermine the reform process. In order for that process of, I call it Peña's Troika, to take place, the president and the PRI would have to disarticulate the interests that carried him into Los Pinos, the presidential residence. The TV networks, the union gerontocracy, the business monopolies, the corporatist bases of the PRI, all of the accomplices of Mexico's system of crony capitalism that the PRI engendered and is still benefiting from. all of the veto centers that indeed pay lip service to the reforms, but are aligning themselves to make sure that those reforms create new cronies instead of dismantling the economic structure that makes them possible. It's true, today Mexico does have a credible narrative for the future. But in order to actually write it, the PRI would have to become what it has never been. A party capable of creating a new paradigm for economic growth and economic inclusiveness and political participation. And at the helm of it, a president that sees the reforms beyond just the celebration of their approval, who is capable of maintaining the reformist impetus alive despite the pressures to quell it, who goes beyond the photo shoot and the cover of Time magazine and the applause and the imagery that has accompanied the reforms and makes sure that their implementation and the elaboration of pending secondary legislation, and this will be key because the devil is in the details, that those processes don't amount just to window dressing. So let's examine reform by reform, the underpinnings, the implications, what has happened, and what comes next. Looking at fiscal reform. A mini reform, a band-aid, a patch, something that doesn't resolve the substantive problem, but rather seeks to temporarily relieve it. That is the reform that has been approved by Peña Nieto's government, and that's the way it should be interpreted. Not as a grand bargain, but as a small intervention. Not as something that is going to revolutionize the relationship, the very bad relationship that the Mexican taxpayer has with the state, but as something that will keep that pact intact. Not as the renegotiation of the prevailing fiscal pact, but as the continuation of the one we've had before. With the same petrolization, the same evasion, the same captive base of taxpayers. The Peña Nieto administration has not sought to change the pre-existing fiscal pact based on what? Little taxation, a lot of spending, and the use of oil revenues to cover the gap. He wants to give that pact CPR. And yes, it does hit the business class by reducing certain privileges like the fiscal consolidation regime. And yet, yes, it does eliminate some preferential regimes, but it is not a reform that contemplates the end of ample spaces for corruption, that entails plugging up all the holes, that attempts to depend less on oil revenue or rationalize public spending. And that's why it falls short. That's why it constitutes really an effort to just raise some taxes, but not an effort to use them better. And that's why it reflects a state that wants to intervene more in the economy without having to spend better or with more transparency. Because what the reform does contemplate is spending. Spending, keep on spending. It's going to generate permanent pressure on the budget by introducing universal pensions and unemployment insurance. It's going to raise spending over revenues and widen the fiscal deficit. It's going to leave behind the fiscal discipline that the National Action Party maintained for 12 years and that the PRI derides. We are in the presence of an important expansion of the state in the Mexican economy. We are witnessing how it pushes the limits of its intervention, but without controls, without supervision, without accountability, because even though the reform does contemplate certain mechanisms for the control of spending, like the centralization of payments assigned to the teachers' union, once again in the hands of the federal government, in reality there are no padlocks. There is no way of dealing with the budgetary allocations that are growing the most, like pension payments for public sector employees. There is no way of reducing the excessive resources that are channeled to political parties, for example. What there is a rise in public spending per se. Net public spending under Peña Nieto will reach historic levels. And the problem is we don't know if those additional resources will line the pockets of bureaucrats or go to the construction of highways and schools. We don't know if they will end up buying another fancy watch for Carlos Romero de Champs, the head of the Oil Workers Union, or if they will lead to the social mobility of those that he allegedly represents. Because the reform doesn't seek to solve the deep-rooted problem of our fiscal pact. It doesn't resolve the dilemmas generated by taxes that are inefficiently collected, by spending that is inefficiently assigned, by public resources that are badly distributed. It doesn't attempt to change the historic dynamic of a state that has little legitimacy to demand more when it spends so badly. And if that doesn't change, no tax collection effort in Mexico is ever going to be enough. And Mexican citizens will continue to evade taxes, and business elites will continue to elude their payment. And the government, instead of rewriting the dysfunctional fiscal pact, will just continue to place band-aids on it. Now, moving on to telecommunications reform. Let's see, before the approval of this much-touted reform last year, there was a lot of responsibility to dole around. Presidents and ministers and regulators and congressmen responsible for allowing that the country's public good, like spectrum, ended up responsible for them allowing for those goods to end up in private hands. Responsible for allowing that two media conglomerates manipulate and blackmail and pressure the political class. Responsible for cutting up consciences so that they fit the size of the screen. Responsible for creating a fourth estate that frequently acts like the first one, above and beyond representative institutions. This is a reality that was constructed in the 1950s, was exacerbated during the Salinas period, was institutionalized in the Fox sexenio, and that now the government is trying to change through reforms to the federal communications law. Reforms that seek to regulate, contain, domesticate, submit the networks to the empire of the law, instead of letting themselves place themselves above it, promoting competition in a sector that badly needs it. Because the last 20 years in telecoms have been years of unfulfilled promises. 20 years in which the Mexican government has not been able to unleash the potential of a crucial sector due to the monopolies and the duopolies that strangle it. 20 years of weak or captured regulatory authorities that don't seem to be able to promote the transition from analog to digital, to open up more than 2 fiber optic threads in the Federal Electricity Commission in order to build an information superhighway that would compete against Carlos Slim. 20 years in which the government allowed dominant players to avoid competition instead of facing it. And suddenly, the shock of the student movement, Yo Soy 132. The public finger pointed at Televisa and Televisión Azteca as manipulative and anti-democratic forces. The election of congressmen and senators who used to work for the networks and now were elected into Congress to protect their interests. And thus the impulse with which all political parties, but especially the PRD, embraced the need to change the law, take on the pending task, confront the veto centers in the media, and reach an agreement to restructure the underpinnings of media power that had become so abusive. Immune to competition, a key reason that explains our dysfunctional democracy, because 98% of Mexicans receive their political information from television. Now, the reforms proposed by the government will try to recover the domain over concessioned public goods. That those who exploit them will be subjected to norms and will not be able to simply act of their own accord as they have been doing. That the president will not be able to simply give away concessions, as he did with Televisa in the past. And that the newly created regulatory bodies will have the capacity to enforce their decisions. That they will have the capacity, for example, to impose substantive fines on those who do not fulfill the obligations of their concession. And if you followed the battle over this issue in the last 2 weeks in Mexico, you'll see that there is a fight over must carry, must offer, which is part of the new law. And this basically means that Televisa and Azteca have to give their signal of their public channels, Canal 2, Canal 13, to cable companies. And the effort is to make sure that the public interest will prevail over the interests of Emilio Azcárraga or Ricardo Salinas Pliego. But that doesn't mean that the war has been won. On the contrary, as we see in the fight over must carry, must offer, which both networks are resisting to the death, the networks are poised to veto and block and use any weapon in their arsenal to make sure that those reforms don't touch them. They have already achieved the postponement of the elaboration of secondary legislation without any consequences. They are trying to make sure that must carry, must offer doesn't happen. And although the new regulatory entity, the IFETEL, has the capacity to fine, open up licitations of spectrum, declare the existence of dominant players, and regulate interconnection fees, its role is currently limited by the non-existence of new rules that Congress should have created, but hasn't. Because congressmen have been too busy slicing up the budget and opening up the oil sector. Because they don't understand that the telecoms battle is the right battle at the right time against the right enemy. And instead of waging it, they are wondering how to declare a truce before the battle even begins. Now moving on to the centerpiece of the reformist effort under Peña Nieto, which is energy reform. The government seems willing to minimize the content, compromise the content and the implementation of other reforms in order to assure the success and the passage of the one that it really wanted all along, the one that it hopes will be the catalyst for growth, the one it hopes will cement the changing international narrative about Mexico, energy reform. And it's good that this has happened, given the diagnosis recently published by the Mexican Competitiveness Institute. A study that exhibits the costs of falling behind, the costs of maintaining the status quo for so many years, the cost of staying behind at the margins of a global energy reform that Mexico has not been part of. Stuck in the same place for more than a decade, according to the Competitiveness Index, because we haven't created the conditions for the economy to take off. And oil is a part of that map that has led us nowhere. In the last 30 years, the proven reserves of oil have grown by 2.5%, as the study reveals. The paradigm about the end of oil is false. It has, and sadly will continue to be, the main source of energy in the years to come. But what is increasingly evident is the difficulty to find and exploit those resources. We are transitioning from the era of easy oil to the era of hard oil. And only the countries with the capacity to develop cutting-edge technology and deal with the new environment will be able to take advantage of it. But in Mexico, for decades, we have been wasting our potential, wasting our time, channeling more resources into the pockets of Carlos Romero de Champs than into the vast majority of Mexicans, channeling resources from Pemex to the government that it should have obtained from taxes. We needed an energy reform that did not privatize oil, but did allow for strategic associations and the liberalization of energy markets. We needed an energy reform that liberated Pemex from its ideological bindings, from the stranglehold of the union, from the fiscal exploitation of the government. And it was supposed to be about taking advantage of lessons offered by other countries that manage their oil sector better than we do. Countries like Saudi Arabia and Cuba and Brazil and Colombia and Norway and Canada that have reformed their energy sectors in a flexible and pragmatic way. to attract investment, to create robust regulatory frameworks, to allow the state operator, like Statoil in Norway, to effectively maximize oil resources. But while all of this was going on, Mexico lived trapped in the past, experiencing a marked deterioration in its production levels, allowing the cannibalization of Pemex by union leaders and private contractors and government officials and all of those who finance corruption in Mexico through black gold. So Mexico, I believe, did need to eliminate the constitutional monopoly in exploration and perforation. It did need to transform Pemex into a real business with transparency and accountability. It did need to promote foreign investment and private domestic investment in refinery, transportation, and distribution, so as to not keep on perpetuating the myth that oil belongs to the Mexican people, when in reality it has belonged to the few who siphon off its wealth for private gain. So how has the Peña Nieto reform addressed these issues? I'd say incompletely and dangerously. And in this context, I'd like to reflect on what for many became the silver bullet, the most obvious solution to complex problems, the only weapon that, according to legends and folklore, can slay beasts and werewolves. The weapon of choice for those who believe that private investment in Pemex is the only way to address problems of productivity, efficiency, corruption, and corporatism. And in an effort to break the statist stranglehold, run the risk of repeating the same mistakes of the past and leaving the real beast alive, the structure of Mexico's crony capitalism and the true evils it has engendered. Too many politicians and analysts and investors have celebrated energy reform because they are centering their gaze on the easy target. They recommend silver bullets against oil workers and their union. They close their eyes when faced with the fact that this reform does not touch the union's privileges. They excoriate the rapacity of public monopolies without taking into account weak regulation that explains the same rapacity in private monopolies. They view private investment as a panacea without understanding that if the rules of its participation don't change, the alleged cure will be worse than the disease. The silver bullet that the reform put in the gun will not bring about promised benefits, but rather renewed opportunities for other cronies. In this case, those close to Peña Nieto and his administration. What Mexico had to think through and didn't was how to modernize the energy sector without just passing on private wealth that it produces. How to extract oil without simply transferring its gains to private hands. How to strengthen Pemex's financial structure without simply creating conditions for more concentration of wealth. How to promote investment in a key sector while distributing the gains for development. Mexico, with this reform, has not answered those questions well, and thus runs the risk of repeating the same mistakes. None of what was approved in terms of promoting private investment is intrinsically bad in and of itself, and taken together, these measures form part of an undeniable fact. The energy sector needed resources, and it became necessary to obtain them from somewhere, given that the finance ministry was unwilling to sacrifice the resources that Pemex provides to the government and its clienteles. So the problem lies in what wasn't contemplated, in what wasn't proposed, in what wasn't part of the debate, something that the business and the political class in Mexico elude: the promotion of competition, the need for stronger regulation, the protection for consumers, the imperatives of the public interest regarding oil and its future. Measures that countries like the UK and New Zealand and the state of Texas implemented when they privatized their energy companies under the supervision of efficient and very powerful regulatory enterprises capable of setting clear rules for new players. That that which would have been necessary to transform the country's economic horizon through the construction of energy markets that benefit Mexican citizens and consumers, and not just the private companies that pressured the government to open up the oil sector with the objective of extracting more rents from there too. Let's examine the privatizations that took place under another much-hailed reformer at the time, Carlos Salinas. Look at those reforms of the late 80s and 90s. We have to do so to understand the magnitude of the mistakes that were made, the depth of the changes that are required in the current context. As one of my favorite World Bank reports entitled Democratic Governability in Mexico Beyond Social Polarization and the Capture of the State argues, the Salinas reforms allegedly sought the same objective that the Peña Nieto reforms are seeking today. Promote economic efficiency, augment fiscal revenues, attract foreign investment, promote competition, create functional markets. But in many cases, like banking and transportation and telecommunications, and I'm sure that many of you as Mexican citizens have experienced what it is to be a consumer in these sectors. Those reforms only produce greater market concentration and less competitiveness in the economy. Privatizations only entailed transferring rent-seeking by the state to rent-seeking by the private sector. They were processes that were friendly to elites and ultimately quite harmful for consumers. And the same thing may happen in the energy sector if the government keeps on believing that private investment is the silver bullet. The ills that Mexico faces are far more complex, and it won't be possible to confront them with just one type of weapon. Despite the reforms, the beast of crony capitalism survives due to the absence of regulatory agencies, strong, autonomous, independent, that can contain those who have been able to establish dominant positions in one sector after another. And that's why Mexican capitalism is so top-heavy. The beast of oligopolistic capitalism survives thanks to the way of governing Mexico in which vested interests have been able to guide public policy in a fashion that guarantees their interests. And that's why energy reform will not be a sign of progress until the regulatory conditions that accompany it improve. So I've given you a small taste of what has been good, what has been bad. I'm going to focus now on what is ugly about Mexico's reality today. Up to now, in this presentation, I focused on the good, the reformist impetus, the bad, the specifics of several reforms and their implications. I'm going to speak now about the ugly, what Reforma newspaper calls the ejecutómetro, a monthly measurement of the number of executions that take place. It reveals that the same number of executions occurred in the first 100 days of Enrique Peña Nieto as took place in the last 100 days of Felipe Calderón. The numbers about criminality in Mexico are among the worst in the Western Hemisphere. And according to Latinobarómetro, over 40% of Mexicans say that either them or a family member have been the victims of violence. Insecurity, according to a study by JP Morgan, shaves off 1% of the country's GDP on an annual basis. The new Mexican miracle has yet to reach the highways of Michoacán or the streets of Acapulco, recently declared the second most dangerous city in the world. Because violence and insecurity persist, even though the conversation about them in Mexico under Peña Nieto has changed. Impunity continues, although no one in the government really wants to talk about it. And there is much to talk about, given the approval 2 weeks ago of a national code for criminal procedures and penal procedures. A code we should applaud and also lament. Applaud for the fact that it introduces oral adversarial trials in a country that needed them, but we should lament parts of it because it deals with what happens in the courts, but does not regulate the police. leading people who are apprehended and then tortured. Interrogation processes that are not standardized or supervised. Policemen who are badly trained. Processes for obtaining eyewitness testimony that do not follow best international practices. So Mexico is going to have clear rules for judges, but not for policemen. And in places like Michoacán, the police are the problem. The courts are the problem. The absence of the rule of law is the problem. In the plazas, in the streets, in Apatzingán, in Zitácuaro, in Morelia, in Tierra Caliente, signs of the emergence of a parallel state. Signs of a microcosm of what is beginning to happen elsewhere throughout the country. In places where the government doesn't govern, but rather la familia or los caballeros templarios do. Where the norm isn't the law, but rather the expression plata o plomo, silver or lead. Where instead of calling the police in search of protection, people prefer to call a cartel or a criminal group to provide it. Where self-defense groups have burgeoned in the absence of a state that cannot carry out its most fundamental task, which is the legitimate monopoly of violence. Story after story of kidnappings, extortion, torture, theft, corruption, and the simple fear of walking out in the street. Story after story of what it means to live in a violence-riddled municipality, in a captured state, under the control of parallel forces that have become, as a teacher in Zitácuaro laments, a second law. Despite the 50,000 army troops on the streets, despite the 20,000 federal police on the highways, despite the over 60,000 dead due to drug-related violence in the last 6 years, criminal syndicates grow, control, and diversify. The democratic transition brought the end of what we call the pax mafiosa that the PRI had produced with criminal gangs. The arrival of an albeit imperfect democracy has entailed the end of old accords and the beginning of new rivalries that not even Peña Nieto can control. And because of that vacuum that organized crime can fill, in the face of the impotence or the incapacity of the government, whether it be federal, state, or municipal, organized crime begins to fill the deficiencies of the state. When citizens do not believe in the police or in the courts, criminal or self-defense groups fill that role. When the state cannot assure the security of employment or avenues for social mobility, cartels begin to do so. And that is the challenge for Mexico. A war, because it's still going on, even though we don't refer to it in that way. A war centered less on the apprehension of drug kingpins and killing capos, and more on creating functional policemen and functional courts. An effort that would require not just using the army as a deterrent and peacekeeper in places like Michoacán, but also a financial strategy to confiscate accounts and a political crusade to combat corruption wherever it may lie, in the courts, and in the municipal presidencies, and in the governorships, and in every corridor of power in Mexico. Now, throughout this journey, I've asked you to take with me this morning. There is one constant recurrent theme: the persistence under the new PRI of the old veto centers, the capacity of certain groups to stall or dilute or block public policies geared towards the public interest, the persistence of organized crime, of criminality, of drug trafficking, of those veto centers that the state cannot also dismantle. And in the face of them stands a weak society and an oftentimes captured government, incapable of dismantling the web of privileges and protection that has strangled the country for so long. Now, many of us believed that the transition to democracy would bring with it a reformist effort geared towards that purpose. Contain, regulate, compete, grow, we were wrong. Now under the PRI, we are beginning to see reforms that did not occur before. But the array of opposing forces should not be minimized or underestimated. Many are still beneficiaries of the status quo and have few incentives to sustain the reform-oriented coalition. Think of the rapacious public sector unions under Peña Nieto, untouched. The businessmen entrenched in monopolized sectors, to this day untouched. The corporatist campesino organization taking advantage of subsidies like Procampo, untouched. The obese and unproductive bureaucracy comfortably installed in the public sector, untouched. Dominant players that behave according to the corporatist clientelist logic of the past and thus sabotage the future. Accustomed to defending privileges instead of accumulating merits, accustomed to extracting rents instead of competing to diminish them. And this extractive, rent-seeking, exclusionary system, so well described in Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson's book, Why Nations Fail, is perpetuated by policies that political parties support. Political parties who are also defending their own fiefdom, their own cartload of public money. Now, according to Duverger, in the same way that men conserve throughout their life the footprints of their childhood, political parties suffer the fate of their origins. And that is why the PRI, as a way of life, continues. That is why it demonstrates selective tolerance towards impunity. And we only have to recall the recent case of Arturo Montiel, accused of corruption during his tenure as governor of the state of Mexico, but who lately has taken to kidnapping his children in a clear violation of the Hague Convention against the illegal retention of minors, with the complete abdication of the government and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in this case. So that is why the PRI insists on things like the illegal practice of using social programs to buy votes. That's why it insists on spending without being accountable for doing so. There still is this widespread and legitimate perception that government is a place where you go to distribute the spoils. Now, in the face of that, there is the new, an electorate that is basically urban, with a growing capacity for communication, a population that is increasingly young and can organize itself politically, as the movement Yo Soy 132 revealed. A society that is learning to resist and denounce and demand, that is learning how to criticize the essence of our authoritarian past, that is learning how to resist the return of that past, that does not want to backtrack on the gains that we've already made. And those fears in Mexico are not unfounded, and they should not be underestimated. Political plurality in the states has reduced. The PRI today is in control of 20 states, 20 out of the 32. And though Eleuterio Gordillo was indeed jailed, old corporatist syndicalism remains intact, as the energy reform that Peña Nieto put on the table underscores, in which he said that the rights of the workers would not be affected. And in Pemex, those rights entail the capacity to simply transfer your job to a family member when you retire. The sanction to corrupt officials in Mexico is not taking place. And the recent exoneration of Raúl Salinas de Gortari underscores this fact. The alternancia among political parties has served to normalize and naturalize and extend old practices into new governments. And I think that's why Mexicans today are disillusioned. And I think that's why so many, when they saw the cover of Time magazine, thought it was April Fool's Day, or why so many caricatures and satirical comments were widespread across the social media. He is not a popular president. And there are more fundamental reasons behind that appreciation. According to a Latin American poll conducted by Latinobarometro, between 2010 and 2011, citizen support for democracy in Mexico fell by 40%. Fell by 9%, and only 40% of those who were polled underscored their support for that form of government. Only Honduras and Guatemala had more disappointing results. We have serious difficulties with our democracy. We have a very rapacious oligarchy that is badly regulated. We have parties that are extremely well endowed, the most expensive parties in the world, and yet they are not particularly representative. We have anti-democratic ways of using power and using public money that persist, particularly at the state level, despite the growing resentment against those practices. And the worst thing is, and we have a judicial and penal system that continues to jail the innocent while it exonerates the guilty. The worst thing is that we have become accustomed to this. The accepted and tolerated dysfunctionality. We believe that unbound privileges and excessive rent-seeking and the absent or intermittent rule of law are an unchangeable part of our national identity. We don't understand that the entrenchment of clientelist, corporatist, rent-seeking logic is greater in Mexico than in other countries, and is a defining reason as to why it is so hard, despite its natural resources, its geographical proximity to the US, despite its millions of talented, hardworking people, why it is that we don't prosper and we don't modernize as quickly as we should and could. And this is an unacceptable situation. It's leading us out of the fold of rapidly growing emerging economies. It condemns 50 million Mexicans to live in a rich country that is poor and unsafe for them. It makes us incapable of promoting investment, competition, equal opportunities, and social mobility for the many. We insist on being an exceptional and unique country in so many ways. Exceptional insofar of the permanence of so many privileges in the hands of the few. Unique insofar as the social tolerance to this fact. And therefore, the real solution for Mexicans does not lie only in the implementation of reforms from above. Real hope, I think, lies in the creation of a context of greater demand from below, with the emergence of citizens who fight for rights and not just for government distribution of the spoils. Those who, to paraphrase Eleanor Roosevelt, would rather light a candle than complain in the dark. Those who continue to believe in Mexico's capacity to change despite evidence to the contrary. Our wide, melancholic, beautiful country, a place described by Efraín Huerta in his poem High Treason, of rivers and fields sick with poppies and mountains spiked with magueyes. I think about our future, a grain of wheat, the ample Mexican heart of stone and air. And that makes many people like me continue to believe in patriotism and social justice, in creative indignation, in participation, in individual rights, in what goes beyond the cynical, cold eyes with men with eyes of men who have them of Desontle and granite, and I'm thinking of Emilio Gamboa and Manuel Fabio Beltrones and Fidel Herrera and Arturo Montiel, and on. In light of them, let's put as a counterpoint the daily decisions of extraordinary Mexicans I know, who jump and move and act, paralyzing the mediocre noise of the streets, calling attention to what ails us, those voices of hope and progress, calling attention to The fear, the corruption, impunity, the abuse, the arbitrary use of power, the stream of fatigues. Voices with which to understand that the real awakening of Mexico lies not just in legislative reforms. It entails the dismantling of what remains of the old authoritarian system and the beginning of new codes of conduct. A united front against the return of some of the worst vices of the past under the new PRI. A citizen coalition so that our eyes don't remain wide shut. The task is Herculean, and it involves us all. Everyone sitting in this room who cares about Mexico. As for me, I think I was last here 3 years ago, and here I am again, ready to work with more determination than ever in the only place I know, with words, and affiliated to the only party I know, which is ours. And perhaps today I'm being a bit of a romantic, but I think of Mexico and I think of more than the good, the bad, and the ugly. I think about my daughter Julia's wild, curly Mexican hair. The nostalgia for Carlos Fuentes and Carlos Monsiváis and Germán Dehesa, who left such a good mark behind them. And the growing urgency I feel, and many feel, for justice and dignity for all. I think of Mexico, and I think of the sun going down on the waves of the beach in San Pancho, a minuscule town north of Punta Mita. I think about the majesty and the mystery of the intricate ruins in Mitla. I think of every meal I've ever had at Luis Herrán, or simply riding on a bike down the streets of Paseo de la Reforma amidst the boisterous crowds on a Sunday morning. I think about the risk of losing our home, our patria, like those who have suffered that fate due to the violence in Michoacán, and the opportunity of recovery, of achieving what Rosario Castellanos wanted, that justice be felt among us. It's exciting to be a Mexican in these times, even if it does coexist with the return of the PRI. I am grateful for that grace. I don't believe we are unchangeable. I don't believe we are unmovable. I don't believe we are inferior to others or we deserve any less. We are from the most transparent region of the air. Fortunately, we are from Mexico.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dresser. Now we're going to open the time for questions and answers. I don't know who wants to ask something. Okay.
Please go ahead and just stand up, tell me who you are, and let's start a conversation. Go ahead.
Thank you for being here. I'm Fernando Herrero. I'm a student here, MBA in Environmental Management. I come from Puebla. I like that you mentioned the fact that we need to be more active civil society in Mexico. I believe that that's my personal opinion, I believe that in Mexico we have a very bad conception of what we can do. We are actually ignorant in some ways. Civil society doesn't mean that posting Facebook pictures and tweeting stuff. It means way more than that. I think that we live under a paradigm of paternalistic government where we feel that the government is both a cause and a solution to all problems when that is incomplete. So I wanted to ask you if you could give us some advice on how to strengthen civil society in Mexico, because it's, in both absolute and relative terms, very silent.
Thank you for the question. I've gotten it probably by now thousands of times. This is nothing personal. I got so tired of it. that I decided to write a book, which is El País de Uno, Reflexiones para Entender y Cambiar, which is a diagnosis of how I see the country. But the second half is really a manual for citizenship, because I began to understand, traveling throughout the country, giving speeches such as these, and on many other topics, that that's what people really want to hear. What do I do? How can I contribute? And it underscores something that is very troublesome, and you pointed at it. What is one of the worst legacies that the PRI left in its wake? A country of people who don't understand their rights. They don't even know how to fight for them. Yeah. They don't know how to organize, they don't know how to mobilize, they don't know the basic rules and expectations of participatory citizenship. So I wrote these 10 commands, like the Bible, and things that people do. And they run from a gamut of attitudinal changes to very specific proposals. And one of the essential attitudinal changes is one that I hope that you, now having lived here, if you go back, do not emulate, because it is so ingrained in Mexican DNA, and it's this genuflection towards power. I oftentimes say in Mexico when I'm speaking, what would happen if instead of me being here, Enrique Peña Nieto were here? What would the attitude towards him be? It would be reverential. And people would stand in line to get their photo taken with him. And women would clamor, as they did during his campaign meetings. Peña Nieto, bombón, te quiero en mi colchón. Everyone would say, thank you, Mr. President, for taking the time away from your busy schedule to devote it to us poor students from Yale. What would effective citizenship entail in a context of anyone in power, whether it be the president, to your municipal president, to your diputado, your congressman? Well, I think Mexico will change the day that someone stands up and says, let's see, Mr. Peña Nieto, could you please explain why, when you were governor of Mexico, more women died there in Ciudad Juárez than in Ciudad Juárez? Could you please explain why your state occupied the last position in Transparency International's mapping of the country? Could you please explain why more cars were stolen in the state of Mexico than in any other place? And by the way, please explain to us why energy reform no tocó ni con el pétalo de una regulación al sindicato. And on and on and on. If we don't create un contexto de exigencia, the people that we have elected, who are actually our employees, will not act in that fashion. And from then on, I map out how to organize a march, how to start a film club, how to start a book club on political issues, how to push forward educational reform, how to fight against a monopoly. These are my 10 ideas, how to use the social media to mobilize. I wish people would look at it and then create their own rules about how to participate. And just emulate what you watch around you. This is a country that has quite thick social capital. And the students that you mingle with are probably involved in 5 or 6 different civic activities. That is not traditional or habitual in Mexico. And all you need in this era is really a computer. This is a personal anecdote, but I think it illustrates what I'm trying to say. Like so many people in Mexico, my internet disappeared. The service left, I didn't have it for 3 days, and I was furious. Because given my work, I really do need the internet. So when I was quite angry, I wrote a tweet saying, Telmex Soluciona, it's been 3 days now, here's my report, my notice. Are you going to come and fix this, or do I have to write yet another critical op-ed about Carlos Slim? And of course, it became the rage in Twitter land. Half the people position to criticize someone. They baptized me as Lady Telmex. On the other hand, the people who had bad internet were completely supportive. So this raged on for 2 days, and finally I thought, well, you know, I've been baptized as Lady Telmex, I'm going to embrace the name. I am now Lady Telmex. And so what Lady Telmex did was create a survey with the help of a friend through SurveyMonkey, a very long questionnaire asking people to measure the speed of their internet. Because the COFETEL, the regulatory entity, has a way of doing so. Measure the speed of the internet, tell me if theirs had ever gone down, if they'd been reimbursed. If they were willing, the last question is, are you willing to participate in a class action lawsuit? Well, what I discovered is what we all know. I mean, that 70% of Mexicans pay for a service they are not getting. They're paying for I don't know how many megabytes of upload and download, and they're getting this. So the robo hormiga is happening every day. So 2,700 people responded to my request in 24 hours, and the survey was long. It took like 5 minutes to complete. What am I going to do with that information? I'm going to start up a class action lawsuit. So if you have a computer, if you have a cause, and you think about it well, you can mobilize people. And I think these are the interesting forms of mobilization that you're starting to see, particularly among the young. And I think that that is what Mexico is. I'm sorry for the very long explanation.
Who has another question? Yeah.
Well, my name is Guillermo Valdez, and I'm a third-year resident in psychiatric here at Yale. Just following up on your
You're
question.
wondering if I'm sane?
We usually hear what Mexicans in Mexico can do for Mexico. And we usually don't have the discussion, or we haven't built a narrative of what Mexicans in the US can do for Mexico. And I am aware that many Mexicans in the US are undocumented, and they're dealing with our problems. They want to acculturate, to join the culture. So many of them have their attention into becoming citizen residents. And in Mexico, we usually just think of the remesas, the money Mexicans in the US send to Mexico. But I'm just wondering if, as a political analyst, are there any examples, or do you have any thoughts about what we can do, what people can do abroad that might benefit Mexico? Because there are so many resources we can find here, Mexicans in Europe, that have upon their reach, that they might be able to do more for Mexico from the outside or from the inside. And I would like to hear your thoughts on this. Thank you.
For the Mexicans who are here at Yale, in evidently a very privileged position, what is my advice? Go home. Not this second, but go home, eventually. I mean, and I know some of you may not like that, but your country needs you. And given that you have had the privilege to be here, in no small measure, it is a privilege that was constructed in the place where you come from. And I think that those of us who are of the middle class have the obligation to give back something of our time, of our energy, of our professional capacity, in order to transform a reality that we all know is not the one we would like to see. In terms of undocumented workers, Jorge Castañeda has written about this. It's an interesting phenomenon. People, Mexicans who spend time in the U.S. in whatever capacity, whether as undocumented workers in a meatpacking plant or as students at Yale, it opens up your world. It opens up your world to the world of effective rights and obligations. Because what happens when undocumented workers cross the border? And this goes against the narrative of, chin, así es México. Todos somos flojos y corruptos. What happens? They cross the border and they start paying their taxes and stopping at stoplights, and they don't beat their wives, they take their children to school. They leave behind perhaps many of the practices that were ingrained in Mexico. And slowly they start going up the ladder of social mobility because you can do that in this country. And those rules don't apply in Mexico. And there's no sanction for bad behavior in Mexico because we don't have the institutional strength to sanction. In the US, if you get stopped 3 times, or I don't know how many it is, they take your license away. And without a license, you are no one in this country. What is interesting about Mexicans going back, or what could be even more interesting in the future, is creating a context for the demand of the respective rights. Because here you do understand your rights. You know, your right to complain. If you pay taxes, which I hope you all do, you have the right to complain. And the government has the obligation to listen to you. In Mexico, we don't have that círculo virtuoso of exigencia, participación y rendición de cuentas. So if you do go back, I think that's the area that people should be working on. You know, through NGOs, through citizen movements, through education. Because public education does not educate Mexicans to understand their rights, or how to fight for them. It educates them to be complacent and silent and conniving, and it educates them to cut backroom deals and to ignore the law or use it in an intermittent fashion. And here you're learning very different things about garantías individuales and how they're protected. So I think that changing mindset is what Mexico needs.
Hello, my name is Andrea. I'm an undergraduate at Columbia University studying sociology and political science. And this is more of a personal question. And not long ago, I was having a discussion with a professor on your career. We're trying to catalog what exactly it was that you did in Mexico. A public intellectual, activist, journalist, even academic. And I wanted to hear more about how your career has been, how you've constructed it, what have been some of the challenges per se in this journey, and also if you'd ever pursue a role in politics, given if the infrastructure weren't as it is or the institutions right now. I'm just curious.
Thank you. Please don't associate the word intellectual with me.
She was like, she's a public intellectual.
No. No, I think of myself as a writer. As a writer first, as a teacher second, as a political analyst third, and as an activist fourth. But all of those incarnations are ones that I love, and I think there's synergy among them. How do I define myself? I think as someone who lives in perpetual indignation. And it's so easy to be perpetually indignant in Mexico. You just have to walk outside. But I think I use all of those hats because I think I'd find one just boring. And the multiplicity of hats allows me and others to participate in many different aspects of social and political life. I do see myself as an advocate for women, and whenever I'm called to participate in anything that has to do with women's rights, I'm there. I view myself as an advocate for transparency and competition. And I started to write my first article about Carlos Slim 10 years ago. And I frequently say that the only thing that has changed since then has been his position on the Forbes list. The regulatory environment has not substantively changed, nor the situation for consumers. I think I view myself as an advocate for real democracy, and probably a more social democratic economic system, which in Mexico we do not have. I support markets, and I also support state intervention. And that makes me an anomaly in a country where people are either free marketeers or statists. And I think at the end of the day, I'd like to be remembered as someone who always dio la buena pelea cuando había que darla, and who paved the road for women who will come behind me, my own daughter, who won't have to face things like being told on the first day of the first time I ever gave a public speech, and I got a standing ovation, and my boss at the time said, "Los beneficios de traer una falda corta." That was 1991. So I wonder if those things will be said to my daughter, and I hope not. And I think that all of us who are women in male-dominated arenas, because I'm frequently the only woman at a rally or at a mesa redonda or at a political event, or even speaking in front of the Senate, like I did 3 years ago, that eventually people like me will open up the spaces for all of those who are coming behind.
Hello, my name is Mariana. I am an undergraduate student at Georgetown University. And you touched upon the topic I wanted to talk about, and that's like female education. And I wanted to see that if you see like gender roles changing in Mexico, and that being like a contributor to the like rise of Mexico, or that you feel that there's like a lot of room for improvement, and that more should be invested in like girl education and girls development.
I've always said that Mexico will be a different and better place if and when it educates its women. The numbers on that are not good. Even at ITAM, when there's an economic crisis, which is like every 4 or 5 years, la matrícula femenina cae. I don't know how to translate that exactly. The number of women who are enrolled descends because the family makes the decision that in a context of tight resources, it is the women who will not be educated. And if you look at the data on women's education, they're the first to be pulled out of school. On average, we only give our population, 7.8 years of educación promedio.
Wow.
50% of all students older than 15 are completely out of school. I mean, that's a whole other can of worms, the educational system in Mexico, but it severely affects women, largely. We're talking about a country where 6 out of every 10 women have suffered domestic abuse, where in 16 states, abortion is completely penalized, even if it occurs in the cases of rape and incest. We're talking about a country where, if you look at the data on what happens in the judicial system, there's a bias against women. Women get higher sentences than men for the same crime. There's a case right now in Mexico City about a young woman named Yakiri, and I'm now part of her defense team. Yakiri was raped, and she defended herself by stabbing the man. She is now accused of homicide because there's a very ingrained bias in the judicial system that if a woman is raped, it's because she was asking for it, given the way that she was dressed. You scoff, you laugh, but this is not, yes, of course it's crazy. So we are, I don't know, maybe 20 or 30 years behind the US in terms of women's rights. I mean, the right to a safe and legal abortion only exists in Mexico City. So I've joked over the years that I would stop criticizing Mr. Slim if he gave me my university to educate women, or something like that. And I'm still waiting for that or the presidential plane. So there is a lot of room for improvement, and that's why I'd like to underscore this again. I know that there are great opportunities for all of you out there in the world. What your country needs you. If you stay here, you will be working in a place where the big problems have already been resolved. In Mexico, the big problems are still there. And I think there's nothing more exciting or attractive or, well, oftentimes frustrating than knowing that what you do there does make a difference.
Because of time, this will be the last question. Here.
Oh, no.
Sorry.
Ortiz, and I combine the uniform from Mexico is feel passion and work for our country. But the question I have for you is why you don't work in the government if you know
Yes,
so much, you know?
My friend Fernando Solana, an ex-minister of Foreign Affairs, said that intelligence lies in recognizing one's own limitations. I would be so bad at it. I have no desire, aspiration, intent to ever work in government or seek political office. Because I think it's important for people to be outside of the system as well, to be vigilant, to be part of the fourth estate, or to be in the trench that is not very full right now, which is the trench of those who are advocating or fighting for rights. I frequently compare Mexico to the US during the civil rights movement. And here it's not an issue of racial equality, it's an issue of citizen rights equality. Because many of those rights are trampled on. Consumer rights, just essential rights. Because they never form part of our political thinking. Many of them aren't even in the Constitution. I mean, however aspirational it may be. So I think it's in that place where people like me can be most useful. Also given, and this is a whole other talk, the structure of Mexican politics and how parties are formed and how they operate, it's very hard for anyone who has any sort of independent thinking and critical thinking to be part of that structure, because the party forces you to discipline yourself. And the citizen candidacies have not, we're just starting to regulate them. And I think it's important that they exist because they will be catalysts for change in the future. But I think of other people who would be extraordinary citizen candidates. I don't view myself as one of them. You know, I'm an introverted nerd. I can't see myself campaigning. I can see myself writing and speaking and using my pen as a sword for the next 20 years, hopefully.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dresser. We're really happy that you were here. We have a little present for you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dresser. Thank you everyone for coming out this morning. We're gonna go to brunch now, so if you can bear with me for a couple of minutes, I explain how this is gonna work. We're gonna go eat at the residential dining halls. For those of you who are not from Yale and who paid for the registration fee, brunch is included. We're gonna be dividing into 5 dining halls. So for the team, you're gonna be taking your speaker to different dining halls. You're gonna go to Pearson, okay? You're gonna go to Calhoun, and you're gonna go to Bradford, and you're gonna go to Ezra Stiles, okay? We're gonna be distributing out meal cards randomly. I encourage you guys to use an opportunity to talk to speakers, enjoy your time with them. Brunch is supposed to last about an hour. We should be back here at 12:30. For those of you who are Yale students, brunch is not included in your registration fee. You can pay with credit card at the dining halls if you wanna go. We're sorry about the inconvenience. Also, so if the speakers can stay with us, we can tell you where you guys are gonna go. And yeah, thank you so much.
Wait. Also, we're planning to take a group picture of everyone in the conference. So it would be after lunch, probably at 2 p.m. in the break, I think. So we will let you know where, and like just so you're aware that 2 p.m. we'll take a group picture of everyone. That's it. We'll let you know where. We'll let you know the logistics after our next speakers. That's it. Any question about anything, logistics, or like that? Good.